Let me tell you about a lie so successful, so perfectly crafted, that it's been repeated for 60 years. A lie that let America off the hook for its sins while pointing the finger at its victims. And yes, it's still working today. In 1965, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a white government official in the Department of Labor, publishes a report, The Negro Family, the Case for National Action. Sounds noble, doesn't it? Sounds like someone trying to help. But here's what it really was, a masterclass in victim blaming dressed up as sociology. Moynihan looked at black poverty in America and said, you know what the problem is? It's not the racism. It's not the discrimination. It's not the redlining that kept black families from building wealth. It's not the underfunded schools. It's not the employment discrimination. It's not the centuries of stolen labor and stolen land. No, no, no. According to Moynihan, the problem was black families themselves, specifically black women heading households. He called it a tangle of pathology. Let that phrase sink in, pathology, as if poverty were a disease black people carried in their DNA rather than a condition imposed by policy, as if being poor was a character flaw, not a structural reality. And here's the brilliant, and I mean that in the most cynical way possible, here's the brilliant part. It worked. The report made it all the way to President Lyndon B. Johnson. It became gospel. It was used to justify cutting welfare programs, underfunding housing initiatives, and promoting this insidious idea that if black people just fixed their families, poverty would disappear. This is where it gets its legs. This is where the mythology takes hold. The welfare queen stereotype? That came from this framework. Ronald Reagan didn't pull that racist caricature out of thin air in the 1980s. He pulled it from Moynihan's logic. When Reagan slashed social programs and told America that poor people were just lazy, he was channeling Moynihan. When Bill Clinton pushed welfare reform in the 1990s, making it harder for struggling families to get assistance, he was channeling Moynihan. When politicians started wrapping themselves in family values rhetoric in the 2000s, they were channeling Moynihan. And let's be clear, black leaders at the time saw through it immediately. James Baldwin called it out. The Urban League called it out. The NAACP called it out. They understood exactly what this was, a way to give white America language that sounded intellectual, that sounded researched, that sounded concerned, but ultimately blamed black people for their own oppression. But the government loved it. The media loved it. Why? Because it absolved them. It said, America doesn't need to fix its systems, black people need to fix themselves. Fast forward to 2015. Donald Trump, then a presidential candidate, tweets out a completely fabricated graphic claiming that 81% of white murder victims are killed by black people. The actual number? 15%. But the lie spread like wildfire because it fit the narrative. The narrative that says black communities are inherently pathological, inherently violent, inherently broken. That's Moynihan's ghost. That's the same logic that says the problem isn't systemic racism, it's black people themselves. Trump later deleted the tweet, but the damage was done. And notice how he faced relatively little consequence for spreading racist disinformation. Because the lie was already embedded in the American psyche, planted there decades earlier. It further strengthens the white replacement theory and white genocide narrative that is used to create fear that white people are under attack from people of color. Now, let's talk about critical race theory. Or rather, let's talk about what conservatives claim is critical race theory being taught in schools, which it isn't. CRT is a graduate-level legal framework analyzing how racism is embedded in legal systems and policies. It's not taught in K-12 schools. But facts don't matter when you're running a moral panic. What's actually happening in some schools is honest teaching about American history, about slavery, about Jim Crow, about redlining, about the systemic barriers that created and maintained racial inequality. And white conservatives are lost their minds over it. Why? Because teaching the truth threatens the Moynihan narrative. If students learn that poverty in black communities was engineered through policy, that families were deliberately broken by mass incarceration, that wealth was systematically extracted and opportunity systematically denied, then the personal responsibility myth collapses. Then America has to look in the mirror. The outrage over critical race theory is the same impulse that made the Moynihan Report so popular. It's the desperate need to avoid systemic accountability. It's the insistence that talking about racism is worse than racism itself. It's the demand that we protect white feelings over black lives. So when you hear someone say, the problem in the black community is absent fathers, ask them, who wrote the crime bill that incarcerated a generation of black men? Who created the drug sentencing disparities? Who defunded the schools and the housing and the jobs programs? When you hear someone rail against welfare and dependency, ask them, who is dependent on whom? Who built their wealth on stolen labor? Who benefited from the GI Bill and the Federal Housing Administration loans that were denied to black families? When you hear someone claim that teaching accurate history is divisive or making white kids feel bad, ask them, why is white comfort more important than black truth? The Moynihan Report wasn't just a study, it was a weapon. It gave America permission to look at the consequences of its own brutality and blame the victims. It created a language of pathology that echoes every time a politician talks about urban crime, every time a pundit talks about broken families, every time someone says, all lives matter, or blue lives matter, in response to Black Lives Matter. From Moynihan to Reagan to Clinton to Trump to the critical race theory panic, it's the same playbook. Deny the system, blame the people, protect the structure that created the inequality while punishing those who suffer from it. The problem was never black families. The problem was, and is, a system that broke those families and then convinced America that they broke themselves.